Welcome to Cold War Conversations, the home of real stories of the Cold War.
This would have been 1972 when Slade were at their heyday. So Slade became my favourite group. I can still sing Goodbye to Jane. I won't.
Well, Noddy Holder's a regular listener to this podcast, so...
Oh, is he?
No, I'm joking. I don't know. Maybe he is. Maybe he is. Mark shares his captivating journey as a child of Royal Air Force personnel during the Cold War. From the moment his parents met in Singapore to their adventures across various military bases, Mark's stories are filled with nostalgia and insight. Mark's father, a skilled electrician, joined the Royal Air Force and was posted to different locations, including Malta and West Germany. Mark recalls the joy of living in Malta, where he played on building sites and enjoyed family outings to Kalafrana, a recreation area for military personnel. The conversation takes us to West Germany, where Mark shares more details about his life at RAF Laarbrück and Bruggen. The camaraderie amongst RAF families created a unique childhood experience filled with adventures and occasional mischief. Mark's reflections on his upbringing reveal a deep appreciation for the opportunities he had, despite the challenges of moving frequently and saying goodbye to friends. He candidly shares his thoughts on the impact of military life on his identity. I'm delighted to welcome Mark Thompson to our Cold War conversation.
Good morning.
Good morning, Mark. How are you?
I'm very well.
Yeah.
I was thinking how weird it was going to be to actually interact with your voice rather than just listen to it.
Yeah, I sort of forget that if I'm in somebody's ears every week, it's a bit weird when you speak to the real voice.
Yeah, it is. It is.
Thank you for sending me your story, because obviously I've done some American stories, and somebody did a poke at me on social media about the British side. So glad you contacted me. So, Mark, welcome to Cold War Conversations.
Nice to meet you.
Well, it's lovely to meet you, particularly a listener as well, and hear your voice and be able to talk about your Cold War experiences. So I'll sort of start where I start with most of my guests. Can you just tell me about your mother and father and how they met?
My father they met in the Royal Air Force. My father's called Peter John Thompson. He was from Glasgow when he joined the Royal Air Force. His father had been exempted from the war because he was an engineer building aerodromes up and down the East Coast. So he was exempt from fighting. Right. He died quite young, and my father ended up in the Gorbals in Glasgow. And when he left school, did his apprenticeship as an electrician and joined the Royal Air Force at the age of 22. So he was older than most new recruits. I don't think, although I'm not sure, that he joined as a national serviceman. I think he just joined. My mother was from Birmingham. So my dad was born in 1937, so they're both just pre-war. My mum was born in 1939. When she left school, I only found out this a week ago, actually. I was asking my aunt. My mum worked for what were originally called British restaurants. You know about those?
Yeah, I think they were set up during the war, weren't they? So that people
could
eat cheaply.
It was a bit of history I didn't know. But after the war, one of the ministers in the Labour government complained that the restaurants that were beginning to burgeon around the country were serving the middle class needs quite well, but nobody was really catering for the working class. So what were the British restaurants became civic restaurants, and they were dotted all over the country. And my mother trained as in catering in one of those. And then she joined the RAF as a WAF. I assume, and my aunt assumes, that she was in catering, but I don't know that for sure. Both my parents are passed now. Don't know about their early time in really early time in the RAF, but they both ended up in Singapore, which is where they met, and married. And my understanding is that the rules at that time were that if a WAF married, or certainly if it was a married couple, then the WAF could no longer be a member of the forces. So my mum became my dad's wife had to leave the Royal Air Force.
And so he's from Glasgow, she's from Birmingham. I can't hear any trace of Brummie or Glaswegian there.
No, not in my accent. No, well, we moved around a lot, so
Yeah.
I've never lived in any of those places. So they met in Singapore, got married, must have come back in the early 60s. It's a period I don't really know anything about. I was born in 1964. My dad was based at RAF Odium. I was born at Aldershot Military Hospital. My dad was at Odium, and he, all the time I knew him, he worked on radar systems. So he'd gone in as a fully qualified electrician, and during whatever aptitude tests that he was given in his early days in the RAF, they pulled him aside and got him to train in electronics on radar systems.
And he was posted to various locations around the world, and you and your mother came along with him. What are your first memories of being abroad?
My earliest memories are of living in Malta. So we did a 3-year tour in Malta. He was working at RAF Luca, I believe it's called. If anybody's listening who was around Malta at that time will know, there's another place called Marshall's Lock. He was working on marine craft. So he was working on boats, again, radar systems. And those boats were converted, what us Commando comics readers would know as motor torpedo boats, I believe, MTBs. And they were used at that time for rescuing anybody who'd dipped into the Mediterranean, but mainly for target towing. So, yeah, but he worked on the radar systems for those boats. I do remember going down to his place of work. I remember having my polio vaccinations and the sugar lumps down there. That was the first time I ever came across a snooker table, which was fascinating. But I don't think I ever went out on the boats. But yeah, we did 3 years in Malta. I believe we lived at a place called St. Paul's. I've got really strong memories of 2 flats that we lived in, and I was young.
You would have been young.
I was really young, but I remember playing on building sites. There's a building site just at the bottom of our road, and me and my friends would just go and play on the building sites when the workers had gone home. I remember jumping off scaffolding onto sand pits and just things that just I don't think would happen these days. Parents are much more safety conscious, but I ended up with a hernia jumping off scaffolding into sand pits. We had a car which we called it Noddy, but it was a crank-handled start. So I remember sitting in it, my dad finding I don't know what it was. It's kind of shaped it a little bit like a Morris Minor, but I think it was an Austin something or other. But he had a crank start. I remember that. Yeah, so I mean, given that I left Malta when I was 5, I've got a lot of memories of Malta. My best memories of a place called Kalafrana, which is where all the military personnel used to go for their recreation. And it had been, I've done a little bit of research on this, it had been a seaplane base during the war and probably just post-war, but it had been taken over and used. We all just went down there and lounged about and swam around in the docks, and it was essentially a dock. There was lots of concrete piers and floats out in the water. Again, I've been put my armbands on, my goggles, and just left to get on with it. Really, I remember this was before I could swim. In my armband, swimming out to a float that they had out in the middle of the dock. I remember my dad he was a good dad, to be honest, but I dived. I forgot to put my armbands on one occasion, and excitedly dived off the dock, or jumped off the side of the dock into the water and through the air, realising I hadn't got my armbands on, and started to drown. If there's anybody from the Kingshot family listening to this podcast, I remain grateful, because one of the Jimmy Kingshot's kids spotted me, ran up to my dad and said, "Mark's jumped into the water and he's got no armbands on." And my dad dived in and rescued me. Yeah, I remember that really clearly.
I can imagine. I can imagine. Gosh, wow. What was your schooling like in Malta?
I went to two schools. My family were never religious, but for some reason, I ended up at a Maltese school to start with. We were Church of England. I'm christened, but I believe it was a Catholic school. So I ended up in a school full of Maltese kids, where all the teachers were nuns and priests. And I don't think I'd ever been to church other than for my brother's christening. So it was all a bit dark. It was an indoor school. There was no playground. There was no outside. Yeah, there was no outside play area. We played on the roof on one occasion, I remember. I'm not sure if it had a cage on top of it, but that was the only outdoor play we got at that school. It kind of left. it was kind of dark. I don't remember being really unhappy there, like distressed, but I do remember feeling somewhat discombobulated and uncomfortable being at that school.
So were you the only British kid in the school, or were there others?
I can't imagine that I was, but I don't remember having any friends. I don't think I could have been there for very long, but it left some sort of very strong memories. I remember we got Coca-Cola. As you know, in British schools we got milk, and we got warm bottles of Coca-Cola dished out to us at break times. No, I can't have been the only British kid, but it was. I just remember feeling lost, very, very lost there. If anybody sees this podcast and went, I know you've got a Facebook page, and can flesh out any of that experience, I'd appreciate it on your Facebook page. But I got moved from there at some point, I would imagine fairly quickly, and I went to what was called the Safi School, which I'm not sure if that's a town in Malta or it's something to do with the schools for the Air Forces or Army and Air Force. I always thought it was an acronym, but having looked it up recently, it might actually be a geographic location in Malta. But that was a school for forces kids. And it was chalk and cheese, because we had a big field outside, lots of colourful. It was lots of things to play with, and that was happy time for me. We didn't get the little pints of milk. We got what you call the little triangular cartons.
Yeah,
I'm not sure what the shape's called. Full of milkshake, like
a pyramid shape almost.
Yeah, kind of like a pyramid. Yeah, and full of milkshake, which I delighted in. And that was a happy time. Lots of kids to play with, and a field, and playing bumper cars and knocking each other and rough and tumbling and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, it was good.
So it was quite warm as a posting then?
Yeah, it gets a bit dark. It must have been, although I didn't know any different at the time. I remember there being a lot of flies in the flats at one time, drunken flies who would have been drunk with the heat. I remember cramming a load of them into the boot of my Matchbox car, which is not very pleasant, but kids are kids. But yeah, it must have been hot. My dad had an aviary on the roof we had two flats in St Paul's. On the second flat, he built an aviary on the roof, and we had budgerigars up there. We had loads of them.
Yeah.
But I don't remember it being uncompromisingly hot. Again, it was hot. We went down to Kalafrana and got in the water and had a nice time.
So your dad's next posting is somewhat cooler in the middle of Lincolnshire.
Yeah, we came back in '69. He got posted to RAF Waddington, which, as you say, is in the middle of Lincolnshire. Waddington at that time was I'm not sure if it was the only one, but it was the main base for Vulcan bombers. So, and he was moved on to the radar system, was working on Vulcan bombers, certainly for the first part of that tour. We lived on camp. I remember all the roads were named after, I don't know if they're presumably bombers. I know it was military aircraft. We lived in Lancaster Close.
As you would. Brilliant.
Yeah, I remember it really well. There was Victor Road, and I remember all the roads being named after airplanes. We went to normal British schools, state schools. It was it's kind of tough for kids that live in those villages because they make mates. I've known this later on in life as well, and kids just move on every 3 years. You make a mate, and then your dad will get posted, and he'll end up he's gone. He's been your best mate for 3 years, and you'll never see him again. So yeah, we were at Waddington. I went to the primary school in Waddington with all the local kids. Most of my mates were RAF mates, and we lived within the confines of the camp, and we're essentially allowed to roam around, really. My mum gave me a fairly wide area I could go out in. What else to say about that? Yeah. As a kid, it was a nice place. As an RAF kid, particularly when you're living on camp, it's really secure. So you're always surrounded by loads of kids because all the adults are of a particular age. If they're living in quarters, it's generally because they've got family. There's just dozens and dozens of kids your age roaming around, playing, riding around on their bikes, playing war, throwing mud at each other, and generally making mayhem. My dad was on the Vulcans. I remember getting taken into a hangar. I don't think I ever went into the plane. I remember going into the hangar and being sort of stood underneath these things. My main memory of the Vulcan is the school was quite near the runway. I remember the flying over the school. On one particular occasion, it must have flown directly over the school because the noise of this thing, it was actually making the desks shake. And you were trying at one point to hold your desk down and also protect your ears. It was just an enormous noise going through that classroom. Yeah, you take it for granted. When you're an RAF kid, you take all that wonderful technology for granted, really. I always found it quite fascinating when people were getting to a lather about going to air shows and seeing all these things. I just grew up around it. It was just normal for me. I got bored with the red arrows. I saw them so often as a kid.
I just want to talk about Waddington and the Vulcan, because it sounds like what you're probably describing there when you were at school was sort of them doing a QRA scramble, like a quick reaction alert scramble exercise, where there would have been maybe 4 or 5 Vulcans taking off simultaneously, which would have sounded like a major earthquake, I would have.
I remember the earthquake. What triggered it, I would have been too young to really comprehend it. I know later on in life, I'll tell you, when we get to the German tour, I know they did practice, emergency practices for war practices, basically. So, yeah, it may well have been something like that triggered them shaking the school.
And were you, at that age, you knew that the Vulcan was a nuclear bomber and that it was going to be dropping nuclear weapons, or not? You just
No, I didn't really have a clue I wouldn't have known what nuke was at that time. I was only 7, 8. No, I just knew that there were these huge, stunning-looking aircraft, and that my dad was part of the system that kept them going.
Well, being a volunteer at the Avro Heritage Museum, I'm delighted that you lived at Lancaster Close and your dad worked on the Vulcan.
Oh, wow.
Well.
Okay.
You get some kudos there anyway.
Excellent.
So your dad's working on these phantom flight simulators. These aren't anything like the simulators you see nowadays, are they?
No, so he retrained, but there was no phantoms at Waddington, and then he got posted to RAF Laarbrück in Germany. I imagine they were setting up the sims then. I don't know when the RAF took the Phantom on. The Phantom was an American airplane. I'm sure most of your listeners will know what it was, the McDonnell F4 Phantom. He got posted to Laarbrück. We were still in Waddington, and there was a good 3-month gap between him leaving and us going out to Laarbrück. The sims that he worked on in Germany at that time were analogue. Modern sims, it's all digitised, but basically it was a cockpit of an aeroplane on a hydraulic system, and the pilot would get in and I don't know if it was actually surrounding. I remember I sat in the cockpit in the room must have been next door. They had a large room, and it was a model. That's maybe 5 meters by 5 meters. And it was quite small scale, so it was basically fields and cows and a little village, and the pilot, I would imagine there was cameras over the model, and as the pilot flew around, the camera shifted around the model. And I imagine that the pilot must have had a little screen in front of him where he could see what he could see. It sounds really basic now. You compare it with modern systems, but I imagine that was probably one of the first simulators. I don't know whether they had flight simulation before that. Do you?
I think that there were simulations of that type. I mean, I think even the tank training was a similar sort of simulator where you're driving over a simulated terrain and targets appear and you can traverse and aim and things like that. I've heard similar simulators for certainly for tank training as well. But yeah, as you say, pre-digitalization. I think there were various tricks played on some of these aspiring pilots as well.
Yeah, they let some bugs onto the model. I believe they sellotaped a caterpillar to the model on one occasion. As the guy flew over the crest of a hill, it was faced with this giant Godzilla-sized monster.
Brilliant.
There was a story. My dad was proud of that story. He told that one for years.
I can imagine.
Yeah, it was good. It was good. It was a good crew. The guys that worked in the sim, certainly at Laarbrück, we all lived very close to each other as well. We went on holidays with the family above us, the Ashwins. Their father and my father were peers in the sim, and we did everything together for the 3-year tour that we were out there.
And were you living off station or on station at Laarbrück?
At Laarbrück, so we were in Germany for 3 years. I did about a year and a half in Laarbrück and a year and a half in Bruggen. In Laarbrück, we were off base. We were at what then were, I believe we were the first people in there. It was called Pizza Flats. It was a kind of large estate as you drove into the village. The village, as I recall, was about 3 or 4 miles from the camp, from the entrance to the camp. It was a small town, really. And as you drove in at that time, on the right-hand side was a large estate which had been built for forces families. So it was a big sort of green central area. It was huge. It was like size of a couple of football pitches, as I remember. And all around that green area were low-rise blocks, up maximum about four stories high, all full of RAF families. Yeah, and that's where we played for the year and a half that I was there.
I was just interested to know, did you have much contact with the local German kids?
No. And when we did, we were kind of insular. We weren't very nice. We were very. I don't know if I told you this in the letter or not. I was going to mention it anyway, but we were kind of that post-war generation. I grew up on war comics, Commando comics, and Victor and Battle comic, and all that kind of stuff. So the Germans were people that we were associated with war, and we were fairly nationalistic little kids, really. Even when we were out with our parents, we were all really polite and nice British kids. But kids being kids, they're not always very nice when they're not supervised. And we would, if regale German kids with straight arm salutes and Heil Hitlers. I'm ashamed. I cringe when I say it now, but we would. I remember doing that at Laarbrück. A couple of German kids wandered across the field, and the English kids sort of ganged up on them and gave what little German we knew, which was Heil Hitler. By the time I got a little bit older, by the time we finished that tour, we moved to Bruggen, I saw other kids doing it, and the penny had dropped that was really quite inappropriate by that time. Fortunately, I matured a little bit. But no, I'll say that. One of my friends at school was a guy called Michael Humphreys, and his mum was German. So his dad was Bob, and his mum, can't remember his mum's name now. And he had two older sisters. Inga was one of them. They were a very German family. They lived on in the flats with us. And there was never any grief with them. We were an in-group, I think, and anybody who was from outside, we were unpleasant children. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think it does. So when you weren't at school, did you just stay on the base and mess around there, or did you roam a bit further afield?
When I wasn't at school in Laarbrück, we were pretty much on the estate where we lived. Around the edge of the estate, I remember my parents taking me into the woods, which were fields length beyond the estate, and there were loads of wild boar in there. We scattered bread out on the floor. They must have a great sense of smell, these things. And all of a sudden, there were about 10 or more wild pigs came out of the undergrowth. Fortunately, there was a sort of large barrow there. We got off the ground. Yeah, so there was wildlife out there. What else did we do? My dad had trained as a sub-aqua diver. That started when we were in Waddington. And by the time he moved to Laarbrück, he was a qualified diver. And when you're in the Royal Air Force, they give you a lot of support for setting up any kind of physical activity, sports and all that kind of stuff. They encourage that kind of thing. So they've been allowed to set up a Laarbrück sub-aqua club. So they've been given a little unit on camp where they stored all their gear, and they built a bar in there, and we used to go out. They used to go out diving at weekends. It was something I got really enthusiastic about. They used to go practice diving in the pool once a week. I used to go with my dad there and sit on the bottom of the swimming pool, breathing through the tank. I remember them going to a Schloss, which is, for anybody who doesn't know, is a castle, a German castle. And there must have been some fighting there during the war, and they dived the Moats. And we go with them on these weekend expeditions, wives and kids, and we just roam around. And I don't think we ever had metal detectors. We would just play in the woods. Well, they dived this Schloss on one particular occasion, and there must have been some fighting there because they pulled out. Somebody pulled out a mortar bomb. And they found a Schmeiser, the old German submachine gun in the Schloss. I don't know what happened to it. I got a feeling it was given to the house owner. Yeah, we just that was quite often a weekend activity. Would have been 1973. I had the opportunity to go. We as a family had the opportunity to go with my dad on a dive expedition. They went to Elba, the Laarbrück Sub-Aqua Club. Went en masse to Elba. I've sent you a link to Did you have a look at the YouTube video?
Yeah, I did. I'm going to add that to the episode information when this goes out, so people.
Yeah, basically, there are some wrecks off the north coast of Elba that were found in the late 60s, and my Laarbrück Sub-Aqua Club were given the right to dive one of the more significant ones in 1973. So we went down there as an expedition. They dived these rocks. We were down there for 3 weeks. They dived these wrecks as a professional archaeological. It was an archaeological dive, really. We're pulling up all kinds of amphora, tiles, stuff from I think it was the 1st or 2nd century AD. I'll send you a link. I found a reference to it a couple of weeks ago, which gives a little bit more information about it. But that was quite fascinating. There was an Italian guy called Gino Brambilla, who was the liaison. He'd been a wrestler and he'd become an archaeologist. And he spent his life, because I've checked, he spent his entire working life post-wrestling going through looking at sort of Etruscan smelting and all kinds of stuff. Very interesting guy. He died last sort of 5-6 years. He must have been very old, but he was kind of renowned in the area for his archaeological work on Etruscan and early Roman archaeology.
And I understand that the West German police would occasionally call out the Sub-Aqua Club.
Yeah, they were called out on at least a couple of occasions to search for bodies. I don't think they ever found anything. Certainly didn't tell me if he did. But yeah, they were called out by the police who were looking for missing persons and suspected that somebody might have fallen into a river or canal. But they were a decent diving club. Quite. They didn't. I was about to say they didn't mess around, but they really did mess around. I remember one guy had he had a dry suit. It was essentially one of the old diving suits with the big bell helmets.
Oh yeah, I used to have an action man with one of them. I think.
Yeah, I believe I didn't. I had the action man with the rubber suit. He had one of these things, so it was sealed around the neck, and he would he would go out into a quarry, wherever they happened to be diving, sink himself to the bottom. Hopefully he didn't go down too deep, but he would crack open an air canister and fill his suit up and rush into the top of the water surface, burst through it, and be bobbing around on top of the water like Michelin Man. So yeah, they did fall around. They did fall around a bit. Yeah. I'm sure there'll be people listening to this who were part of that. Yeah.
Yeah. So was Laarbrück a phantom station?
To my knowledge, it was a phantom station. I don't know what else there would have been there. Okay, I was probably 10 when we left, so still fairly young. You know, I knew about the phantoms on the basis. I tended to know about the planes my dad worked on. It had been, actually, I'll say that, when we went to school, it was one of the few schools I ever went to that had the house system. And the houses were named after British military aircraft from sort of the previous generation. So there was Lightning House, Buccaneer, Javelin, and Canberra. It amazes me that I remember little things like this, given I was so young. But yeah, they were the 4 school houses. When we were at Bruggen, we ended up at a new school, which was the sort of the birth of the comprehensive system. But Laarbrück was the tail end of the old imperial system. And I remember being taught about sort of 19th century British heroes like Elizabeth Fry and Cadbury's and all kind of things that kids these days would not. My son doesn't know who Elizabeth Fry is or Scott to the Antarctic, but that was the kind of imperial age education. We got the tail end of that and the early part of the comprehensive system. In Malta and in Waddington, I've been fairly cut off from civilization, really. So I knew nothing about pop music or anything. And I remember when we went to Laarbrück, kids in the class were much more worldly than I was. I remember being asked who my favourite group was. And I didn't have a favourite group because I didn't know anything about music. And that was the era, it was the start of the era, this would have been 1972, when Slade were at their heyday. So Slade became my favourite group at that time. I could still sing Goodbye to Jane. I won't. Yeah, so
you weren't a T-Rex fan then, or?
No, I was later, but that was Slade. But certainly all the time I was Slade at Laarbrück. The Osmonds were a big thing.
Well, Noddy Holder's a regular listener to this podcast, so...
Really?
No, I'm joking. I don't know. Maybe he is. Maybe he is.
Well, if you are, thank you, Noddy. It was great fun. Yeah, so we moved, halfway through the tour, we moved to Bruggen, and I was on camp. For some reason, all the other kids in my class were off camp, but the Ashwin family who lived above us moved with us, and my dad was on the flight simulator at Bruggen. So we were all on camp, so we had friends.
So is Bruggen a bigger base than Laarbrück?
I couldn't tell you. At Laarbrück, wherever I went on Laarbrück, I was in my dad's car. At Bruggen, I was that little bit older, which makes quite a difference when you're a kid. I had a bicycle, and I used to just roam everywhere, really. We'd roam the camp. Sort of living on camp was very self-contained. There was a massive naffy, which for getting everything that we wanted. There was a cinema. It was a mixed base. There were a number of, there wasn't a huge amount of, but there were American kids there, and there must have been American forces there because they had a PX. And I know they used to be able to get hold of stuff that we couldn't get hold of. I can't remember what, but I do remember being very jealous and having a really strong desire to be able to go shopping in the PX, which I wasn't allowed. We weren't allowed to.
So did you mix much with the American kids or not?
There weren't that many about. They didn't go to our school. So I lived in a little row of 6 or 7. It's a little terrace. I lived at one end of it. At the other end, we were an American family. We didn't mix, certainly for most of the time I was there, but I did get to know them. They were the Haynes family. The lad was called Bobo Haynes. We didn't mix a great deal, but yeah, we did pull down the wall that was between us. It's just kids, you just stick to your own, really. I think that was the problem. But and of course, we went to different schools, shopped in different shops.
So did you see much of Germany while you were there? Did your mum and dad take you out in the car and, you see the towns and cities?
I think they were, one of the reasons they went, he wanted the posted to Germany. I had a younger brother, I got a brother 3 years younger than me, was that he wanted us to tour and travel and see something of the world, which I'm incredibly grateful for. Because over the 3 years we were there, we travelled over all of Western Europe, really. Well, I say all. We were as far north as Denmark, trips down to Italy, and holidayed all over the place. In terms of week to week, we gravitated more towards Holland because the bases that we were on were quite close to the Dutch border. So when we went shopping, we'd go to Venlo or Nijmegen in Holland and do our shopping there. I don't remember. I remember going to the Ruhr Dam. Which is the one that got knocked out by
the Mona Dam?
Yeah. I remember going to see that. We travelled a lot. We would have explored Germany on our trips when we were going through to Austria and Italy and down to the Alps and stuff like that. We'd have explored Germany. But normally when we went out on a sort of weekend jaunt and that, we tended to go to Holland. My main memory, my takeaway from Holland is the frikadelle and sausage. Have you ever had a frikadelle?
No, I don't think I have.
It's I suppose it's a Dutch equivalent of a bratwurst, but it's not really a bratwurst. It's quite a long, wrinkly thing, probably made of similar meats. They're equivalent to fish and chips, really, but we lived on those we delighted in fricadelle and chips for years. And the other thing I picked up from the Dutch, brought back to this country, was a love of mayonnaise.
I was going to ask you about that because, I'm still a hardcore vinegar on my chips.
Oh,
maybe
my
a
God.
bit of salt. I'm not a mayonnaise fan.
You heathen. I developed I don't think I'd ever had mayonnaise before we went out there. So your chips ketchup was obviously what we'd have as British kids. And going out there and find chips, frickin' chips with mayonnaise. It was a habit I've never got out of. I'm currently trying to lose a load of weight. Probably through years of abusing the mayonnaise.
Yeah. What was the schooling like in Germany?
As I said, in Laarbrück, we got the tail end of what I would call the imperial age of education. We learned about Elizabeth Fry and Scott of the Antarctic.
Yeah.
Arctic.
Yeah, Scott of the Antarctic.
Who else would we have learned about? Probably not John Peel, Robert Peel.
You might have been listening to John Peel, but not learning about him, maybe.
Yeah. And then we went to Bruggen, and they were building a new school while I was there, and it got opened while I was there. And it was the Leonard Cheshire School. And Leonard Cheshire came to open it. They built two schools, one next to each other. One was primary school, must have been primary. They were for different age groups. They were essentially part of the same complex, but different schools. And one was the Douglas Bader School, and one was the Leonard Cheshire School. And I remember Leonard Cheshire came to open our school, and I assume Douglas Bader went to open what would have been my brother's school. And that was the start of comprehensive education for us. So you're on camp. I think the one regret or one failing, I think, of the education that I had in Germany was we didn't learn any German. Just little bits and pieces. I think that language education, we fail as a nation with language education. But I didn't come away with any, after 3 years in Germany, with any significant command of the German language, which I think is a failing. We had this comprehensive system, brand new school. That was lovely. It was lovely. Go out and play football in the playgrounds. And
was there a cinema on site, or?
There was a cinema at Laarbrück, and there was a cinema at Bruggen. At Laarbrück, I remember we used to go to a Saturday matinee. So we'd get dropped off. The kids would get dropped off. It was mayhem. All the parents would be dropping their kids off. And we'd all go into the cinema and we'd watch two films, and we'd be out of our parents' hair for 2 or 3 hours on a Saturday morning. And I just remember it being absolute chaos in their kids running around.
So what were they showing to you in a Saturday morning? I seem to remember things like Flash Gordon and things like that.
Just sort of 1950s and 1960s horror stuff. I remember some film about ants taking over the world. Kind of, you might have seen
sci-fi, sort of sci-fi stuff.
Yeah, all kinds of stuff. It was all kind of B-movie stuff, really. You might have have been Laurel and Hardy, anything just to try and keep us occupied for a couple of hours, really. Television wasn't massive. We hadn't had the big access to television in Waddington before we came out. We had a black and white telly, and watched Star Trek, Blue Peter, and Gunsmoke, and Garrison's Guerrillas is something that I remember that nobody else seems to remember.
No, I don't remember that. Was that a British Forces broadcasting channel?
No, this would have been
in Waddington.
That was in Waddington.
Right.
Out when you're out in Germany, and certainly in Holland, as I said, we live next to the Dutch border. The Dutch are brilliant with languages. They speak English better than we do, but they would broadcast a lot of more American TV. So we got to see. So that would be on Dutch channels. We got to see Columbo, Kojak, what's the Partridge Family.
All right. So were these were subtitled in Dutch, so you could hear the English, yeah?
Yeah, we got the English version of it. So Saturday night.
Yeah.
Saturday night we'd all go around to the Ashwing's house and watch whatever detective drama was on. Must have been films and things like that as well. But I certainly remember Columbo, Kojak, and the Partridge Family. Right. Don't remember any British television particularly.
So can you remember as a kid watching, like, going to the cinema or something and seeing the Battle of Britain and some of those big movies like that?
I do remember being taken to see the Battle of Britain. I don't remember. I don't know what age. I think that was when we got to Laarbrück. So that was right on it, early on in my German tour. In fact, I'm sure it was. And I was a bit confused by it. I would have been 8. I couldn't really make sense of what was going on. The first film I remember, war film I remember comprehending. Oh, what was the one with the Clint Eastwood where they fired paint? The one where they stole all the gold out of the...
Oh, Kelly's Heroes.
Kelly's Heroes.
Yeah, with Donald Sutherland, and they buy the Tiger tanks off the Germans or something.
That made sense to me. Yeah. But the Battle of Britain was... I couldn't really comprehend it. Something I'm not mentioning in a letter when I wrote to you, which I think is worth mentioning. First black lad I knew, the first black lad I ever met actually, was a lad called Michael Watson, and he came on to Bruggen, really getting towards the end of our tour. So I only knew him for a few months, but we became friends. He lived off camp. There certainly was no, he was just a kid in our class, no racism or anything like that. The reason I mention it is because he lived off camp at Elms, I believe it was called, which is a small settlement about half a mile outside the camp. And there were a lot of RAF personnel in part of Elms. And I met him on camp one weekend, and we sort of wandered off camp and up to Elms. And I just remember being slightly puzzled because his family had a much nicer place than everybody else, but they were housed separately. And I've always wondered whether that was because he would have been one of the early black members of the RAF. Yeah, they were sort of separate, housed separately from everybody else. Nicer accommodation is my recollection, but separate. I just thought that was worth it. I kind of noted it in my head. Hello, Michael Watson, if you're listening.
And I mean, anybody who's listening to this episode, we will be posting information in the episode notes, but also join our Facebook group, which is a great location to discuss your Cold War experiences. And if you know Mark, then he'd love to hear from you on there as well. Do go ahead and check that out. Mark, one of the questions I wanted to ask you was, you're on an active, or you're on active RAF bases, so you must have experienced the tachyval.
Yeah, I found out later in life that tachyval was an attack evaluation, was a simulation of war. For many, many years, I thought it was a tacky, Tackycky, Val, and never quite understood what a tachyval was. But yeah, it's an attack evaluation where the penny finally dropped. They basically the camp was put on full alert and had to pretend that a war had been declared. So my dad would disappear for days on end and come back in an NBC but paper suits basically, NBC micro.
Yeah, nuclear, biological, chemical, NBC.
Yes.
Yeah.
So he'd be wearing that all the time. He'd be doing long, long hours. And when the bases are protected by the RAF regiments. I remember one particular incident during one of these attack evals. We were out playing in the playground at playtime. These guys in fully armed, rifled up, camoed faces, came sidling across the road towards the school, climbed over the wall when we were in the playground. And it's a little bit like the intro to Dad's Army.
Yeah. I can see it now.
Yeah, so they from one end of the playground to the other, looking from side to side for Russians, and disappeared. we all just did goggle-eyed staring all there. It was good fun.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
Were you told by your parents what to do if the balloon actually went up? Because there were allegedly plans for evacuation of civilian or non-military personnel.
No, I don't think there was any plans to evacuate us. I know later on in life, when the collapse of the Soviet Empire and the Soviet archives were opened up, I remember reading an article. Probably it must have been in the Evening Standard when I worked in London. There was a graphic of all the places where the Russians had nuclear weapons pointed, and essentially it was everywhere I ever lived. So I don't think there was much chance of evacuation, but it was never mentioned to us. No.
Yeah. So where was because your dad's last posting is back to his homeland, really?
Yeah, we moved in 75. So Germany was 72 to 75. And then my dad was posted to Lucas, RAF Lucas. Again, I think still working on, certainly in simulation. I think it was still Phantoms at that time, but they were being phased out and replaced with the Jaguar, I think, by that time. And we lived off camp. Again, I lived in Cooper and went to the local primary school for the last of or middle school. Castle Hill School I went to. I never went to the local senior school. And yeah, my dad did his last year there, but he was there a year and a half, something like that. And then he was given the opportunity to take voluntary redundancy, which he did. And because he'd done so many years, they gave him a decent amount of money as redundancy pay. And he was able to buy a house, or not outright, but we bought our first house down in Buckinghamshire. Not a lot I can tell you about Luke. Well, I didn't go on to base at Lucas very much. I lived in Cooper, mixed with the local kids, picked up a Scottish accent within about 3 days.
Well, you want to fit in as a kid, don't you? Fit in.
I went out. I remember going out to the local sort of woodland area with an English accent, meeting a lad, making friends with him. His name was Craig, and going home from a tea with a broad Scottish accent that I didn't lose until we moved back down south a year later.
And I can tell you got the Buckinghamshire accent now, or certainly Southern England. Yeah.
I'm a Southern boy. It's been a long time since I lived up north.
Yeah. When you look back on your time as an RAF brat moving around all these different locations, what is your most favourite experience or time that you had?
Early on, Kalafrana, even though I nearly drowned.
Yeah,
Kalafrana was a wonder to me as a young kid. I've never been back to Malta. My brother went back on a cruise a couple of years ago. He was born there, but I don't think he has a great deal of association because he doesn't remember it. But Kalafrana, all the things I've said, really. I mean, the Vulcan bombers flying over the school and having to hold on to the desks. It was in Lincolnshire. Me and my friend Pete Mullinger going out into the fields behind his house and sitting in the middle of the field chewing on sugar beet. Being in Germany and going out and seeing the boars in the fields just below, in the woodland just behind our house, the wild boar. They're all great memories, really.
What is your sort of worst memory of your time following your dad around the world?
Do I have any bad ones?
That's fine if you don't.
I don't think there's any bad memories, even though I didn't realise it at the time. It was a fascinating world to be in. I suppose one regret, I didn't join the forces. I was born in '64. My adolescence was through the punk era, so I became quite rebellious, and there was no way I was going to join the forces. And I think I kind of regret that a little bit. I think I'd have had a good life in a different way to what I've had. I not become such a rebel and joined it. I'd shed enough of that rebelliousness to have recommended it to my son, although he hasn't gone down that path.
Can you remember where you were when the Berlin Wall opened and how you heard about it?
Yeah, I was living in Peckham. I was
Del Boy country.
It was Del Boy country, yeah. I was a member at that time. I was a member of the Socialist Workers' Party. Yeah.
This sounds like the start of a whole new episode, Mark. Now.
Yeah, I was a foaming commie at the time. Yeah, I remember all that happening at that time. It was generally considered to be a good thing. I've been over to Berlin since then. I've got my friend Dave, spent many years living in Berlin. Yeah, that's what I was doing. I was working in IT, living in Peckham, being a pain in the arse Trotskyite.
Right. So were you on all the C&D demos and things like that?
Yeah, all that stuff. Yeah, for many years.
Maybe we need a part 2 about that. Were you involved? Were you involved in any of the direct action?
No, well, I stayed at Upper Hayford Peace Camp briefly. I was on a couple of demos down there because that was just down the road from Aylesbury, where I grew up when we left the RAF. I don't think I'd get an episode out of that. I mean, I was just used to go on demos really for years. I got very political and far too political for too long, and I don't think it really enhanced my life that much. I'm still fairly political, but I've mellowed out a lot in my older age.
Yeah. As we all do, Mark. As we all do.
Yeah. I never went to Greenham, although I had friends who went down there. Upper Hayford was close to us, which was an American base. They had a long-term peace camp down the side of there. I stayed there a couple of times.
Yeah, because there were some really big demos at Upper Hayford. I seem to remember. I think there was one where hundreds got arrested, or significant number.
Yeah, I never got arrested for anything like that. But they breached a fence at Greenham Common. I don't know if they ever did that at Upper Hayford. I don't know. I'd have to look it up. Yeah. I would say the one thing I was going to say I haven't said is that after my dad left the RAF, he stayed in defence. So he first worked for Radio Fusion, did all kinds of things. They made best known for televisions, I believe, but they also did the flight simulators. So he was constantly back and forth to Bruggen and Laarbrück for years as a civvy, working on their on the sims that he worked on while he was in the RAF, and then he left. He worked for Marconi, worked for Hunting Avionics, and I think at one point he was managing simulators, a collection of simulators for the Royal Air Force, and employed Michael Ashwin, the kid who lived above us when we were at Laarbrück. I believe ended up working for my dad at one time on the sims as I think he was in the RAF himself. So what goes around comes around.
Yeah. Wow.
Well, it's been a good chat. Your podcast's excellent, and we tend to dwell on the Second World War and the great conflagrations of history when we're looking at history. But as you spotted yourself. It's a real niche for talking about that long, cold, dark, nukes pointing at each other period of history that we all lived through.
Absolutely, and there's so many different stories. Even people talking about the same subject have a different view, or they see different things or different angles. But Mark, it's been great chatting with you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your time and showing an interest.
Don't miss the episode extras such as videos, photos and other content. Just look for the link in the episode information. The podcast wouldn't exist without the generous efforts of our financial supporters, and I'd like to thank one and all of them for keeping the podcast on the road. If you'd like to help, go to coldwarconversations.com/donate. The Cold War conversation continues in our Facebook discussion group. Just search for Cold War Conversations on Facebook. Thanks very much for listening, and see you next week.